Hello, my name is Samantha, and welcome to the 6th lesson in the Girls in STEM Java curriculum. Last lesson, we talked about for loops and while loops. Today, we'll be talking about nested for loops. I'd like to introduce Lucy, who will be the instructor for today's lesson.
Hello and welcome. My name is Lucy and I'll be your instructor for today. Let's get started. We'll need to set up Repl.it for all of our warm-up and practice problems today. You can start by creating a new Repl.it called Lesson 6. You may pause the video here if you need to. Last lesson, we learned about while loops. For a quick review, a while loop continuously executes a block of code so long as the specific condition is true. On the slide, we can see the general while loop structure. Note that there should be a counter or a variable that updates inside of the while loop. Otherwise, it will keep on looping indefinitely. We also covered for loops last week. A for loop is similar to a while loop because it executes a block of code continuously. However, a while loop loses an outside variable, whereas a for loop will use a counter variable created and controlled inside the parentheses. When we create a for loop, we have the keyword for and 3 sections inside a pair of parentheses in the header. The for keyword is followed by an initializer of an integer I. Usually when we create for loops, the integer, or the counter variable, will have the names of I, J, or K. Then we have a condition that determines how many times the loop is run. In this example, our loop will run 5 times since we start at I equals 1 and go until I is less than or equal to 5. In the third section, we have the incrementer. This actually creates the iterations or run-throughs of the loop. I++ will increment the iteration number by 1. If we change this to something like I equals I plus 2, then we should have an iteration number 1, 3, and 5, and the loop itself will be repeated 3 times. Finally, we have the code block inside the for loop, which is executed during each iteration of the loop. Now, we'll do a few warm-up problems. Our first problem asks us to create 2 strings of at least length 5 and check if the first 2 characters of the string are the same. If you need help with string methods, check out some of the slides from Lesson 3, which can be found in the description below. Our second and third problems check out the understanding of certain concepts. Without running the code in Repl.it, what will happen when the following code block run? You can pause the video here, work through the problems on your own, and resume the video once you have attempted or completed the problems. Let's go over warm-up number 1. We can start by creating our 2 strings of at least length 5. Then we'll make 2 more strings, subname and subname 2. Then we'll store the first 2 characters of each string using the string method. Recall that substrings can take in a few inputs. In this case, it'll take the index of the string we want to start from, which is 0, and the index of the character we want to store up to. This will take AL from our example strings. Then, using an if statement and the equals method, we can check if the substrings have the same characters. If subname equals subname 2, then we'll print that the 2 strings have the same first 2 characters. If not, we'll print that they don't have the same first 2 characters. For warm-up number 2, this should print numbers in the range of 3 to 7 inclusively. We first create a variable with the value of 2. Next, we have a while loop with the condition A is less than 7. If A is less than 7, we'll increment A by 1 and print out the value of A. Once A is equal to 7, we'll break out of the loop since the condition is no longer met. For warm-up number 3, we have a for loop that will print numbers starting at 19, then decreasing by 3. We initialize a counter variable j and set it equal to 19. Our condition will stop when j is no longer greater than -1. Our incrementer statement is actually a decrementer and subtracts 3 from j during each iteration of the loop. Our code block just prints what j is in the output. We can see how the for loop decreases our counter variable. Now we'll move on to the topic for today's lesson, which is nested for loops. When we place a for loop inside another for loop, this is called nesting. When you nest two loops, the other loop will repeat the inner loop and the code inside of it. Let's look at the structure on the left. We have our outer loop with a counter variable I and an inner loop with a counter variable j. For each execution of our outer loop, the inner loop will be executed in its entirety. In the output, we can visualize how nested for loops work. All right, let's try some practice. This question asks us to use a nested for loop to print 6 rows of 6 stars. The print statement inside the inner loop should repeat a star and a space. This will make the output look nicer. Pause the video now and resume the video to go over the answer. If you're stuck, try working on the outside loop first. Then make the header for the inner loop. Also, the counter variable for your inner loop should be different from your outer loop. Here's the key. As always, this is an example solution. Your code does not need to look exactly like the solution we made. So, how can we approach this question? If we use a single for loop, we can make a string of 6 stars and print it 6 times, with each string on a new line. With a nested for loop, we're going to print each star individually. We can first set up the outside loop to repeat the inner loop 6 times. The counter variable I is set to 0 and will increment until 1 is equal to 6. You may notice that our counter variable starts at a different number than our example. If you start with I equals 1, your condition should have something like I is less than or equal to 6, or I is less than 7. Generally, the convention is to start your loop with 0. Then we'll make the inner or nested loop, which will repeat 6 times. Inside, we'll print a star with a space. The counter variable of the inner loop, j, is set to 0 and will increment until it is equal to 6. After the nested loop, but inside the outer loop, we'll add an extra new line to format our stars correctly. If we accidentally use print ln in the inner loop, we'll have 36 lines of single stars. Now, we only want to print half the stars. We can edit the code we wrote in problem 1a or make a copy of it and edit the code. This exercise will use a nested for loop to print 6 rows of stars in an increasing amount. For example, row 1 will have 1 star, row 2 will have 2 stars, and so on. As seen in the sample output below, like the previous question, your inner loop should repeat a star and space. Pause the video now and resume the video to go over the answer. And here's the key. How could we approach this problem? Well, we know we'll have an increasing amount of stars on each line. If we think back to our previous example, we could have done that using a single for loop. It would be a bit harder to do this problem with one for loop. However, we can see that we'll still have 6 rows of stars. That means our outer loop probably doesn't need to be changed. Since our inner loop controls the amount of stars actually printed, that's what we'll focus on. In our question prompt, we notice that each row is referred to as row 1, row 2, and so on. Row 1 will have 1 star, row 2 will have 2 stars, and so on. This can be translated to our outer loop. To solve this question, we only need to change the condition of the inner loop. If we change the condition to be j is less than or equal to I, then we create the desired output. Our first iteration will print 1 star, our second iteration will print 2 stars, and so on.
Hi, I'm Alexis. Thanks for watching and congrats on completing your 6 Girls in STEM lesson. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us at our email ccagirlswhocode@gmail.com or comment down below.
I wanted to thank the following for all of their hard work that went into today's lesson. All of the slides, videos, and problem sheets in this series are available on our website as well as the description below. If you would like more practice with nested for loops, check out our video called Lesson 6 Exercises. I hope you'll join us again in our next lesson on arrays.